In the 4 years I've been making videos here, Irrational's XCOM project has been one of my most requested videos. For nearly 7 years, various versions of the first-person XCOM project moved through 2K Studios, carefully intertwined with Bioshock's rise to prominence, the studios behind the sequel, and even the true XCOM successor seen from Firaxis. It's time to finally take a look at Irrational's XCOM FPS, how players were left feeling betrayed, what actually went right, and how it led to the closing of multiple studios. For Irrational Games, the era between System Shock 2 and Bioshock can only be described as unlucky. While the biggest names in the immersive sim genre crumbled around them, the studio managed to just barely stay afloat with odd superhero tactics games and squad-based shooters. It was only when they began work on a System Shock 3 did the pieces start to fall into place. During pitches to publishers, the sentiment was overwhelmingly, "We love the series, but immersive sims just don't sell." When working with GameSpot on a retrospective for System Shock 2, the team would discuss a new idea, a more accessible take on the genre focused on action and linear design. Only then did publishers take notice, and in 2005, 2K purchased Irrational, giving them the funding and support to turn an odd FPS RPG hybrid prototype into the fully realized Rapture. As development on Bioshock entered its last couple years, the two founders, Ken Levine in Boston and John Che in Canberra, Australia, already were looking to the future, and they knew what Irrational's next game should be. An FPS reimagining of the tactical game XCOM, a franchise 2K recently acquired. The exact way 2K ended up with XCOM is a story befitting a bulletin board in Fox Mulder's office. The original UFO Enemy Unknown, or XCOM as it was known in North America, released in 1994, developed by two brothers, Julian and Nick Gullop, at their company Mythos Games. Publisher Microprose, co-founded by the name at the top of countless computer games Sid Meier, retained the rights and developed a handful of sequels. In 1998, Microprose was acquired by Hasbro Interactive, whose parent company would sell off the interactive portion to Infogrames 2 years later. Infogrames, following the cancellation of an FPS alliance and a more traditional 3D reinterpretation of the original Genesis during the merger, created the pan third-person shooter Enforcer. It was the only XCOM project to release for 11 years. In 2005, following a brutal fiscal year, Infogrames/Atari sold off the rights of both XCOM and Civilization to 2K, who, around this time, had also acquired Sid Meier's and team's new studio Firaxis, who would be put on the latter. Irrational, during their acquisition process, seemed very aware of this. The original XCOM was one of Che and Levine's favorite games. Following work on a short-lived, true turn-based successor, they'd see the potential of converting the franchise to a real-time, big-budget FPS game for new audiences. During this time, the XCOM FPS took a lot of different forms, primarily at Irrational Australia. Initially, the team focused heavily on being as true to the turn-based experience as possible. While it was still real-time, the team turned to Gearbox's brother-in-arms and Pandemic Squad Simulator Full Spectrum Warrior as influences, allowing the player time to think and make squad decisions without actually stopping combat. It built on their work on their tactical shooter SWAT 4 as well, but struggled adapting the friendly AI to more open corridors. There were still concerns that something this thinky wasn't what FPS players were looking for. Another iteration involved managing a mobile alien base and dropping in and out of battle like a Call of Duty campaign to fight off alien kaiju. This was, after all, only about a year since Spielberg's War of the Worlds, a film focused on massive tripods emerging from underground. While this was ongoing, two things were happening. First, 2K made the move to rename the two Irrational studios to 2K Boston and 2K Australia. While 2K Boston would be reverted back to Irrational a few years later, 2K Australia would remain without an identity. To me at least, this signals 2K's attitude towards the two studios. The one in Boston was the main one, while the team in Australia acted as support, despite them laying the groundwork for the next game. A lot of 2K and their parent company Take-Two Studios are associated heavily with one or two auteur figures even to this day. Gearbox and Randy Pitchford, Firaxis and Sid Meier, the Hauser brothers at Rockstar, and so on. It's a gross oversimplification, but it doesn't feel unlikely that 2K's attitude was that Irrational was the one with Ken Levine, and Ken Levine was in Boston. The second thing that would happen was Irrational in Boston was working 7-day work weeks to finish Bioshock. The development was grueling, and last-minute changes like recasting Atlas and responding directly to focus testing and player feedback made for a better game, but proved tricky to implement so late in production. But at launch, Bioshock succeeded at being exactly what Irrational had wanted it to be. In a very short time, they went from a small team making, frankly, kind of weird games, to a team of about 90 making weird games that actually sold and won Game of the Years. As the hype settled, 2K turned to Irrational and Ken Levine to ask if they'd be interested in immediately doing a follow-up. They'd politely decline. A chunk of the team of both Irrational and 2K Australia relocated to 2K's headquarters in Novato, California to form 2K Marin, and began work on a direct follow-up to Bioshock, with the team in Boston setting its sights on XCOM. 2K Australia offered support to both.
Ken comes on and says, "This is what I want to do. It had nothing to do with what we have done before, so we threw that out."
Irrational in Boston, under the guidance of Levine directly, worked on XCOM for somewhere between a year and 18 months, putting together a new idea focused on a resistance in the wake of a total alien invasion, with the player encouraging humanity to rise up as a Dave Grohl-inspired hero. The second XCOM from Firaxis would do something similar years later, but this also doesn't seem far off from Half-Life 2 and even the ideas for the cancelled Doom 4 at id, though I don't think that project was shown off publicly just yet. The exact reason for Irrational passing on the project comes down to a lot of factors. In a retrospective on his career from Games Radar, Levine cites a quick turnaround and trouble with the quote, clumsiness of squad control in an FPS. Again, a growing team and a brutal end to the development of Bioshock were still pretty fresh. When stating that it was unlikely they could make a good game in the amount of time given, 2K's response was simple. Great, someone else will. Jason Schreier's book Press Reset, which offers a great look into both 2K Marin and Irrational at this time, points to Levine renegotiating his contract with 2K and a desire to give Bioshock a true sequel, even despite them passing on the project initially. Regardless, work on their version would end by mid-2009. They'd slowly spin up development on Bioshock Infinite, and 2K Australia, who was in a similar role as they were on Bioshock 1 for Bioshock 2, got the project once again, this time rebooting it into what the public would actually see. With the launch of Bioshock 2, work could truly begin. It was a chaotic start that was all too common for Irrational.
We tend to work in an evolutionary process, which is a polite way of saying we take a long time to figure out what the hell we're doing.
Taking inspiration from the real-world UFO reporting program Project Blue Book, 2K Australia redeveloped XCOM's blend of tactical combat and resource management into a prequel set in an idyllic 1950s. Starring FBI agent William Carter and 2 squadmates, the game focused on the horror of being an under-equipped G-Man using standard-issue equipment against an inscrutable force from another world. Missions played out first with investigations, photographing and gathering evidence, until they devolved into visceral, frantic action. Gone was the pulpy feeling and tactical, deliberate pacing of the original, and instead what was shown was a heavy survival horror influence and a continued through line from their successes on Bioshock. This was much more an Irrational game rather than a true XCOM reboot, but there was still the higher level team management. Choice is at the forefront. Utilizing a high-tech for the time facility, players were tasked with choosing which missions to take on in a semi-real-time environment. If you chose one mission, the others may not be available to you when you return, and all of it came down to balancing the public's opinion on you, resources like the extraterrestrial element Illyrium, and gathering intel. A large portion of our information on this version of XCOM comes from a cover story from official Xbox Magazine's Ryan McCaffrey from 2010, as well as interviews in and around that year's E3. It seems like the game was still very early on, as it's a little unclear if your squad mates are random, as the article puts it, red shirts, or actually fleshed out characters, and the moment-to-moment commands either seem rudimentary or underdeveloped. That being said, it seems to be in a strong state, and was expected by the end of 2011, despite only truly being in full development for a few years. As a fan of Bioshock, I think it's an impressive-looking project, with its Mimic from Prey 2016 style enemies, almost Team Fortress-inspired character models, and an emphasis on horror by way of Americana. While I did talk about being subscribed to Game Informer in the Borderlands video, at this time I'd also managed to pick up a subscription to OXM through a band fundraiser. and I remember tearing through this cover story. As a fan of all things pulp sci-fi, and especially Pandemic's Destroy All Humans, this was absolutely up the alley of a 14-year-old who loved shooting games and had never heard of the original XCOM. The sentiment around E3, however, is notorious. It's, of course, the clip heard around the world.
Betrayal! What? Betrayal! Betrayed me! This game sucks! It has nothing to do with XCOM. Nothing! Nothing!
This is one point of negativity that exemplifies the sentiment felt across now ancient GameFAQ forum posts and even Kotaku articles from the time. Fans of the series felt justifiably skeptical and, of course, betrayed, with many pointing to the other failed real-time outings seen in the past. Not to belabor the point, but it does feel very similar to the sentiment that still exists to this day around Bethesda's Fallout 3 and the cancelled Van Buren. This was the trend of the time. We were even a few years out from EA doing something similar, turning Bullfrog Syndicate into Starbreeze's neck-breaking simulator. It probably most reminds me of that quote from Obsidian's Josh Sawyer on the way isometric CRPG games faded out in the early 2000s. The fans never left that style of game. Publishers did. It's clear this was certainly happening at 2K around this time, even despite the genuine passion behind the project and those actually making the game being big fans of the original. Executives did not understand that tactical games weren't just a thing of the past, and it seems they were learning this in real time with this announcement. On the other hand, though, seeing developers try desperately to get ahead of the narrative and express that this game isn't necessarily feature complete after they've been developing and redeveloping feels like one of the great reminders of how messy game development is, and how much work goes into making it this far only to be wholly dismissed like this. I mean, after all, this Angry Joe video does include a segment where the two discuss how Spec Ops: The Line looks like just another military shooter, so sometimes these previews aren't necessarily the full picture. Behind the scenes, however, things weren't going much better. For one, a few months before E3, 2K Australia received another name change to 2K Marin Australia. The actual Marin was technically just acting as support, initially only on multiplayer, and were hoping to begin work on their own IP following Bioshock 2, but were instead forced on to, quote, grunt work by 2K. It seemed like the Australian team was being separated further from the studio they came in with, segregated completely from Irrational for reasons that seem unclear. As the project went on, Marin's role grew, dreams of their own IP faded, and the work between the two studios became more and more intertwined. Both studios across the world from each other were now collaborating on just the single player. The energy and the hope of a group of people setting out to found the original Irrational was now a chain of subsidiaries with no identity. Justifiably, tensions grew between the two studios. Marin saw themselves being pulled on to fix a broken project they were only supposed to be supporting, and Australia saw another studio coming in at the whim of their parent company and stepping on a project they'd been working on for about 5 years. 2K, on the other hand, saw only numbers, people, and now rampant negativity. Many of the original Irrational staff departed, with founder John Che leaving in 2009, well before the game was even shown off at E3, citing him growing tired from the cryptic decision-making of a mega company like Take-Two, and ironically the ever-constant reboots of XCOM. Design director Ed Orman left not long after as well, due in large part to the conflicts between the two studios. Between 2010 and 2011, due in part to the conversation around the game and the shifting executive team, the XCOM project changed dramatically. Things like the underdeveloped squad tactics now saw a full rework, allowing for a god mode blowing out into third person, slowing down time, and returning to that thinky game attitude seen in earlier prototypes, all while trying to find that XCOM core again. In order to add some balance and move away from the original prototype's horror focus, the team reworked their enemies as well into something that acted more predictably and resembled the original game. From a story perspective, the team chose to move the game out of the 1950s and into the 1960s, moving away from McCarthyism and the aftermath of the Roswell crash into the age of Kennedy, Apollo, and the space race. Pulling away from their more stylized character designs of both agents and aliens and taking inspiration from the right stuff in James Bond, the team saw an era that was more visually distinct and ripe with conflict. A lot of these changes seem like direct responses to the criticisms heard about the previous version of the game, though judging by some interviews, these same criticisms were definitely being felt internally. Regardless, what started as Irrational's FPS take on tactics games was now spread across 2 studios, an 18-hour time difference, and conflicting ideas. In Maryland at Firaxis Studios, another developer under the 2K umbrella and founded by former members of Microprose, the idea of working on another XCOM was a bit of a running joke. One developer, Jake Solomon, de facto protege to game design legend Sid Meier, sat down to develop a prototype way back in 2003, and it was, as he put it, a fucking mess. Years later, as work finished up on 2007's Civilization Revolution and the team looked to the future, they saw an opportunity to spin up another franchise alongside the hugely successful Civilization. Being a studio with a better track record, a more recognizable figurehead, and, as a result, more freedom to make their own decisions, the team was one of the very few exceptions to the niche computer game rule. Solomon once again pitched a reworked version of XCOM, and the next 5 years would be dedicated to a more true to the original reboot. As development was ongoing, Firaxis realized firsthand the struggle to pitch a game like this that appealed to more than just hardcore fans of the original. Following another internal reboot and a hard lesson on the difference between complicated and complex, the team released 2012's XCOM Enemy Unknown. At that time, Marin's first-person shooter still hadn't been released, despite starting almost 2 years prior. 2K Marin Australia, now dropping the Marin name, was taken off the game entirely at some point in late 2011, tasked instead with, as was the trend with the studio, support on Bioshock Infinite, but also on full development of the new Borderlands the pre-sequel, taking over for usual series developer Gearbox so they could focus on next-gen tech for Borderlands 3 and their new IP Battleborn. Almost overnight, all the accents and interviews change. Marin found themselves in charge of a project that was deep into development, with more than its fair share of problems, and with basically no interest in the project. To be blunt, any other game at any other publisher would have been cancelled. Iterating and reiterating like this isn't common for games that have already been shown off to the public. All of that to say, when Marin took control, they made one more dramatic yet obvious change. XCOM was now third person, and redubbed the Bureau XCOM Declassified, which finally released in August 2013, 8 years after it was originally conceived at Irrational. Playing the finished game, it's obvious that it's trying very hard to appeal to everyone, and as a result, feels a little unfocused. Both an extremely of-its-time third-person shooter and a squad-based tactics game are present here, often forcing you to juggle both at the same time, fumbling with its lack of hotkeys and very dumb AI. If I was going to make a straightforward comparison, Mass Effect probably comes to mind, but Garrison Rex just didn't need to be micromanaged this much. In the Bureau, your nameless, faceless squad mates do. On the same side, something is clearly lost from the days when this game was under Irrational. Gone is any feeling of an improvised fight very early on. The XCOM team already has seemingly limitless supplies and resources, and alien weaponry and tech come with almost no explanation. It may be a prequel, but I find the idea of going back a little further, like Irrational wanted, to be a bit more appealing. This is a conflict that has already escalated into a war more than anything, and the game wants to handwave tension, paranoia, and mystery in favor of action. That being said, in hindsight, being a game that's of its time isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some of my favorite games are from this era, and it's just more of that. The Bureau sits alongside games like Obsidian's Alpha Protocol and Raven Singularity in being a weird Xbox 360 game I didn't play when it released, but really learned to love because it's just so 2009, even despite releasing 4 years later. It does have its problems for sure. Characters feel like little more than walking archetypes, your player character William Carter especially. While the alien designs are more consistent with Enemy Unknown and the original XCOM than the Black Goo monsters 2K Australia envisioned, some of the designs are so sharp in contrast from the 1960s, but not in a way that feels intentional. And of course, as with all games with tactical elements on the controller, wrestling commands and making sure Carter isn't standing directly in swinging distance of a giant alien monster takes some getting used to. But I think it's a surprisingly impressive title, especially considering the road it took to get there. The quality of the Bureau didn't actually matter to anyone with any power. 2 months after release, a very small handful of developers would be tapped by 2K to join a new studio with former Epic Games and Irrational executive producer Rod Ferguson in the same office. The rest of the team would be left go. Ferguson departed the studio, named Hangar 13, not long after, and was replaced by former LucasArts project lead Hayden Blackman. Despite this, 2K announced that Marin, a studio that didn't really exist anymore, was in charge of the future of Bioshock in 2014. As in the wake of Bioshock Infinite, Ken Levine started a newer, smaller studio, Ghost Story Games, and began working on Judas, a title that still isn't out at time of writing, and will almost certainly be a story covered here eventually. As far as I can tell, the team 2K is actually referring to here became Cloud Chamber Games, who's making Bioshock 4, made up of, ironically, former Firaxis developers and, hey look, a returning Rod Ferguson. I'm really doing my best here, but this side of 2K is just a mess. The team in Canberra, 2K Australia, released Borderlands the pre-sequel in 2014. Despite this, due in part to inflation increasing the cost of developing in Australia and discussions around a potential move to Melbourne resulting in the departure of many of its upper management, 2K would also close them in 2015, because of course they would. The idea of converting XCOM into real time is a unique challenge, one that doesn't feel compatible with the extraterrestrial decision-making processes of AAA development. But the legacy of Irrational's XCOM project serves as a reminder of the messy, near-constant iteration of design that goes into making games, how long titles can languish in pre-production before being shown off to the public, and how agile a team has to be to even get a game over the line. But at the same time, it's also a reminder that games that seem niche like XCOM do have an audience. Firaxis' work all but proved it, seemingly by accident and in spite of what was going on at Irrational. In the wake of Enemy Unknown, countless indies and huge titles like Marvel's Midnight Suns and Mario + Rabbids have seen success in the same way games like Pillars of Eternity, Wasteland, and Baldur's Gate 3 have shown that there are audiences for CRPGs. These niche computer game genres are in the midst of a renaissance to this day. It's a lesson that publishers seem to be slowly learning, but it's hard to not wish it didn't cost us some of the more interesting voices in gaming.